Hello, I'm Daniel, and welcome back to the Library of Ideas, created by the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. This is the fourth episode of The Universal History of Civilizations. We leave the deserts of Egypt behind and travel east to the valleys of mist and river, where humanity first imagined that harmony itself could rule. This is China before China, the birth of order, between heaven and earth, the mandate of kings. Long before the walls of any empire rose, China was a landscape of rivers and fog, a land that both nourished and destroyed. The Huanghe, the Yellow River, flooded without mercy, drowning fields and villages beneath its shifting gold. Legend says that the wise Emperor Yao looked upon the chaos and sent his minister Yu to tame the waters. For 13 years, Yu walked the valleys barefoot, sleeping in the open, carving channels with his hands. He did not stop, even when passing his own home, fearing that one day of rest might cost the people their lives. When at last the river obeyed, heaven rewarded him with the throne. Thus began the Xia dynasty, the first to claim that power flowed not from conquest, but from harmony. In the villages that stretched along the riverbanks, a new order began to take shape. Farmers learned to measure the flood's rise, digging canals that followed Yu's design. Bronze tools appeared, heavy and bright, pulled from furnaces that glowed like small suns. In distant hills, miners broke ore from stone, their faces darkened by soot. One of them, an old man named Wei, believed that the ring of his hammer echoed in heaven itself. "If I strike well," he told his son, "the world stays steady." To him, this was not poetry, it was policy. Every action carried cosmic weight. In homes of packed earth, women tended hearths and ancestors. Each morning, they placed bowls of millet before wooden tablets carved with family names. Smoke rose from incense as prayers joined thousands of others, binding the living and the dead in one unbroken lineage. At dusk, children sat beside their elders, tracing early symbols onto thin slips of bamboo, marks that carried no sound, only reverence. Writing was still ritual, not communication. The ruler, the farmer, the craftsman, the mother, all were threads in the same divine pattern. When the floods were kind, it meant the king's virtue was aligned with heaven's will. When they were cruel, his mandate of heaven was shaken. Yu and his descendants were not gods, they were guardians. They ruled not to command, but to preserve balance between earth and sky. By 2000 BCE, the Xia realm stretched across the central plains, scattered with workshops, granaries, and altars. It was not yet an empire, but an idea. That order was sacred, and duty held the world together. Above them all, the heavens turned in silence, watching the first people who dared to believe that governance itself could be a form of prayer.
Sometimes thought needs silence to unfold. If these ideas find a place in you, perhaps stay a little longer. Subscribe and walk with the Library of Ideas. There's much more waiting beyond this page. Let's turn it together. In a moment.
The Shang and the language of heaven. When the Shang kings ruled from their capital, at Anyang, the world seemed ordered by fire. The furnaces blazed in bronze foundries, the hearths burned for ancestors, and the altars flickered with sacrifice. Between 1600 and 1046 BCE, this kingdom became the first in China to leave its voice in matter, carved on bone, cast in metal, and whispered toward heaven. Each morning, Smoke rose from temple courtyards as priests carried turtle shells and ox shoulder blades to the sacred hearth. The king himself often stood beside them, for he was both ruler and high diviner. A question was carved into the bone. Will the rains come this month? Shall we march against the tribe to the north? Then the shell was heated until it cracked. The pattern of the fracture was heaven's reply. The question and the result were then inscribed side by side, forming the earliest Chinese script. These oracle bones were not written for memory, but for communication with forces unseen. Writing at its birth was prayer. The king's duty was to keep that dialogue open. He spoke for the ancestors, a long lineage of spirits whose favor guaranteed life and order. The living and the dead were bound into one vast family, stretching backward into myth. Every act of rule, every hunt, every battle began with invocation. To govern was to interpret omens. Beyond the palace walls, molten bronze flowed like captured lightning. Artisans poured it into clay molds, shaping ding and gi, ritual vessels carved with dragons and clouds, symbols of the invisible world. A young worker named Zhou fed the furnace with charcoal, the fire stinging his eyes. He did not know the king's name, but he knew the rhythm of offering. 3 strikes of the hammer, 1 breath to the gods. He believed that if he faltered, misfortune would follow. His labor was ritual, his sweat a form of faith. Even warfare was ceremony. Chariots of wood and bronze thundered across the plains, led by nobles wrapped in plaited armor. Before battle, they washed their hands in sacrificial blood and invoked their ancestors. The warrior's courage was not his own, it was borrowed from the dead who watched him. When victory came, captives were taken not for profit, but for propitiation. Some to serve in temples, others to feed the spirits through fire. At home, women tended altars etched with ancestral names. A daughter, barely grown, would pour millet wine before the family tablets, whispering gratitude for the harvest. In these quiet gestures lived the same devotion as in the grandest royal rites, that the universe remained in balance only through attention, memory, and reverence. The Shang realm pulsed with cosmic reciprocity. The king ruled because heaven listened. Heaven listened because the king remembered. To forget a name, to neglect a rite, or to misread a crack in bone, any of these could loosen the threads that held earth and sky together. In the glow of the oracle fire, a priest once murmured, "Words are bridges to the unseen." And so they were. Each carved sign carried the tremor of awe, the fear that silence might bring chaos. The Shang did not write to tell stories. They wrote to keep the universe intact. The Zhou and the mandate of heaven. The Shang had believed their kings ruled because their ancestors willed it. The Zhou, who overthrew them around 1046 BCE, at the Battle of Muyi, brought a far more daring idea, that heaven itself could give and withdraw the right to rule. No dynasty, however divine it claimed to be, owned eternity. The king governed only while his virtue remained in harmony with the moral order of the cosmos. This covenant was called Ming, the mandate of heaven, and it would echo through 3,000 years of Chinese thought. King Wu of Zhou stood on the battlefield beneath a red dawn, the cries of the fallen fading into dust. He raised his bronze sword to the sky and declared that the tyrant of Shang had lost heaven's favor through cruelty. His victory, he said, was not conquest, but correction. Yet even in that triumph lingered a shadow of fear. If heaven could abandon one dynasty, it could abandon any. In the new capital near the Wei River, Zhou society arranged itself like the heavens. The king sat at the center, the pole star, around which all else revolved. His brothers and vassals governed the provinces, bound by oaths, gifts, and ritual feasts. They built ancestral temples, conducted sacrifices, and recited from the Book of Documents. Heaven sees as the people see. Heaven hears as the people hear. People hear. Rule had become a moral performance. Justice and ceremony were now its twin foundations. Among the scribes and priests, new thoughts began to germinate. A record-keeper named Li spent his nights inscribing reflections on bamboo slips. Ren, benevolence. Why, righteousness. Lie, ritual. To govern, he wrote, was to teach, to obey, to participate in harmony. His words were not yet called philosophy, but the seed of Confucius was already alive in them. In the villages, children learned songs from the Book of Songs, verses of ploughing, courtship, and the turning seasons. They repeated them aloud, unaware that these simple rhymes were lessons in virtue. Be diligent as the farmer, be pure as the river, their elders said. Morality was no longer the privilege of kings. It had entered the classroom. Even the warriors changed. They offered wine to their ancestors before battle, for courage without restraint was rebellion. Generals were taught that victory without virtue led to ruin. Even the forging of weapons followed sacred calendars. War itself was to serve balance, not ambition. Meanwhile, the thinkers of the late Zhou asked whether order came from rules or from nature itself. Lao Tzu, the royal archivist, whispered that the greatest ruler governs least, that the Tao, the way, moves like water, gentle, nourishing, unstoppable. His words drifted like wind through the bamboo forests of scholars. Some sought harmony in discipline, others in surrender. The debate itself became the heart of Chinese civilization. In the palaces of Lu, Jin, and Chu, rulers built walls and alliances, fearing the loss of heaven's favor as droughts and rebellions multiplied. The very mandate that had legitimized Zhou now haunted their descendants. Each omen, an eclipse, an earthquake, a failed harvest, was read as heaven's warning. By the 5th century BCE, as Zhou authority fractured, they had already given the world a new empire, an empire of thought. From the craftsman to the king, all lived beneath the same invisible law, that harmony, not power, sustains the world. In the hush of the temples, where incense curled like mist, the people prayed not for victory, but for balance, for the mandate to linger just a little longer upon the earth. Echo, the mirror of heaven. I walk among the broken altars of Anyang. The wind moves across the plains like a slow breath, lifting dust from the same soil that once bore the bones of kings. I am a historian of the Han court, a keeper of stories already fading. The oracle shells lie silent now, their cracks unread, their gods forgotten. Only the shape of their questions remains. Will heaven still listen? The book of changes lies open in my hands. Its hexagrams whisper of cycles, rise and decline, order and decay. I trace the ancient lines and think of Zhou, whose rulers believed that virtue could bind the sky itself. And yet here, the heavens seem indifferent, vast, cold, endlessly balanced. The mandate of heaven. Once the crown of kings, now feels like the leash of men. In the distance, a farmer bends over his furrows. He does not know the classics, but he lives by their echo, planting when told, bowing when required. For him, harmony is not philosophy. It is survival. I wonder whether the sages mistook stillness for wisdom. The world they built feared chaos so deeply that it chained the soul to ritual. Perhaps heaven's mirror was never meant to reflect perfection, only change. The river flows, dynasties crumble. Maybe the truest order is the courage to let it. Thank you for joining me, Daniel, here at the Library of Ideas, created by the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. Our journey through China before China, the birth of order, ends here, but the story continues next week. India, the empire of the mind. And remember, every Wednesday, we explore another side of thought in the history of economics in 25 scenes. Until then, may your life stay as balanced as the Zhou calendar, though preferably with fewer sacrifices and less paperwork.